If you'd like to support this channel, please consider purchasing a copy of my book, Captain Steel and Other Stories, on Amazon. Inspired somewhat by a post on my last video by Mr. Hi Diddly Ho himself, Life with Matthew, I'm going to rate my top 5 Star Trek Doctors. Let's begin. But before we begin, based on previous experience, I feel the need to make a disclaimer. This video is about my top 5 Star Trek Doctors. I am in no way saying that this list is of the top 5 Star Trek Doctors. Most of you will not agree with me, and that's fine. Understand that before you watch this video any further, this is not a my way or the highway situation. Don't be a salty dunce and send me an emotional message that I have given you some sort of narcissistic injury because of my innocuous choices. Okay, now we can begin. Dr. the Fifth, Joseph Mbenga, from Star Trek Strange New Worlds, played by Babs Olusanmokun. I'm butchering that name, but that's what I'm going with. I'm just going to call him Babs from now on. While I'm generally not a fan of Secret Hideout's interpretations of Star Trek, I do have to say that I like what they've done with their reimagining of Dr. Mbenga from the original series. Originally played by Booker Bradshaw in 2 episodes of the original series, Mbenga has been altered for Strange New Worlds into the CMO, Chief Medical Officer, of the Enterprise, having originally been presented as a junior physician under McCoy. The storyline in the first season, in which Mbenga is secretly hiding his terminally ill daughter in a transporter buffer in order to buy himself time to find a cure for her, was a good way to introduce the character. Since Strange New Worlds clearly takes place in a different continuity than the Berman era, it didn't bother me that Mbenga was using a technique that Scotty would more or less invent many years later in the TNG episode Relics. In Strange New Worlds' second season, we get a lot more info about Mbenga himself and his experience as a combat medic during the Klingon War. Turns out he's probably the best hand-to-hand combatant on the ship. This aspect of the character endeared him to me because he reminded me of my submarine's hospital corpsman, who was easily the toughest guy on the ship, having been part of a Fleet Marine Force unit in his younger days, jumping out of perfectly good aircraft right alongside the Devil Dogs. So Mbenga from Strange New Worlds is my number 5. Dr. the Fourth, Leonard McCoy from the original series and the J.J. Abrams films, played by DeForest Kelley and Carl Urban. I'm lumping the 2 versions of this character together because it doesn't seem fair to pit Urban against Kelley. Many would put McCoy as their number 1 choice simply because he was the first series regular Doctor on Star Trek. I call that legacy points. McCoy was a self-described old country doctor. While most people remember him as the guy who always seemed to lose arguments with Spock, he won a small share of such arguments and formed the moral and emotional corner of the original series triangle. One of McCoy's most badass little moments was in the episode Space Seed, in which he stands his ground while Khan has a knife to his throat.
Well, either choke me or cut my throat. Make up your mind. It would be most effective if you would cut the carotid artery just under the left ear.
Carl Urban's McCoy was the best thing in the J.J. films, and he was woefully underutilized. If the next Star Trek film set in the J.J. verse was a solo film about Carl Urban's McCoy character, perhaps based on John Byrne's Star Trek Leonard McCoy Frontier Doctor comic book, then I'd gladly go see that in the theater.
I may throw up on you. Don't pander to me, kid. One tiny crack in the hull and our blood boils in 13 seconds. Solar flare might crop up, cook us in our seats. And wait till you're sitting pretty with a case of Andorian shingles. See if you're still so relaxed when your eyeballs are bleeding. Yeah, well, I've got nowhere else to go. The ex-wife took the whole damn planet in the divorce. All I got left is my bones.
Doctor the Third, Julian Basher from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Originally portrayed as a naive young officer who had much to learn about not just Starfleet life, but life in general, Basher was played by Alexander Siddig. That's his stage name. His real name is on your screen right now, and I'm not going to risk mispronouncing it. In the beginning, Dr. Basher was the least liked character on the least liked Star Trek show. Star Trek Deep Space Nine showed us a darker side to the Star Trek universe by focusing on a remote frontier town in space, in which Starfleet characters represented the minority of characters presented. The thing people didn't realize early on was that we really weren't supposed to like Basher yet. His arc was that as he matured, the audience would gradually warm up to him as his character coalesced. Gradually, we learned that he liked mid-20th century spy fiction and often played such a character on the station's holosuites. In the early episodes of this series, there was a detail about Basher that seemed trivial but came up every now and then. You see, Basher could have graduated at the top of his Starfleet medical class had he not misidentified, quote, a preganglionic fiber for a postganglionic nerve during the final exam. Thus, he had to settle for salutatorian, or second place. This bit of trivia about him would later become more mysterious when, while under telepathic attack from an alien, it was revealed that the mistake was virtually impossible for someone to have made, given his education. It wasn't until the 5th season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine that the significance of this was revealed. Basher, as it turned out, was secretly an augment, a human who had been genetically re-engineered. Born mentally deficient and clumsy, his DNA had been illegally resequenced in a procedure his parents had paid for off-world. These procedures left him with superhuman intelligence, hand-eye coordination, and stamina. He had managed to keep this a secret for years, but when his parents confessed this fact to a holographic version of himself, the cat was out of the bag. Basher was, for all intents and purposes, a benevolent version of Khan. This led to several fascinating episodes in which he treated and counseled a group of people similar to himself, but who had all been driven insane by their enhancement. But for me, the best Basher story took place before his genetically engineered backstory was introduced. The episode was called The Quickening, a story about Basher and Dax encountering a Dominion world called Teplin, where the inhabitants are being punished by the Dominion for attempting to resist. The punishment is an engineered plague called the Blight that causes painful lesions to form throughout the body and typically limits the lifespan of the Teplins. All Teplins are so afflicted. Basher arrogantly presumes to cure the Teplins of the Blight. The Blight proves to be most insidious, as the Dominion engineered it to get violently worse when exposed to the electromagnetic fields of medical technology, like the equipment Basher relies on. Basher does manage to create a vaccine for the Blight, but while it won't cure the Teplins, it will prevent their children from having the disease. The scene where Basher shows a young mother her unblighted newborn as she herself dies from the disease is one of those high points of Star Trek that few people talk about. You can't help but feel something here. Doctor the Second, Phlox, from Star Trek Enterprise. As a prequel series, Enterprise had a problem. How do you present a doctor who can do more than the doctors of today can, but still has equipment and techniques that are less sophisticated than the ones McCoy used in the original series? Their solution was brilliant. Dr. Phlox kept alien creatures in his sickbay and used their various secretions and other aspects to provide cures and treatments for the crew of the NX-01. For example, when Trip needed a transplant to survive, Phlox had a creature in his possession that could become a clone of Trip if they injected it with Trip's DNA. He also used eels and leeches to cauterize the crew's wounds and burns. Phlox was both jovial and creepy at the same time, As the first Denobulan we saw in Star Trek, he also got to introduce us to some of their more interesting physical features. We got to see him shaving his tongue, for example. He could also expand his face like a pufferfish. His planet was also overcrowded by human standards, and so when he was forced to work by himself while the rest of the crew was unconscious, he would hallucinate, perhaps as a psychological defense mechanism against isolation. Phlox is also notable for doing something that very few, if any, Star Trek characters have ever done. He beat Borg assimilation. In the Enterprise episode Regeneration, Phlox is infected with Borg nanoprobes. Ordinarily, these would instantly turn someone into a Borg drone, but his Denobulan immune system proved to be too complex, and this bought him enough time to figure out how to use Omicron radiation to effectively kill the nanoprobes. Okay, before we get to my number one pick, I'm going to zero in on one Star Trek doctor who did not make the cut. The emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, played by Robert Picardo. I have noticed that a lot of fans out there pick this character as their favorite Star Trek doctor. He would not be my first choice, nor would he even be in my top 5. The reason is simple. He's not a doctor. His software isn't even based on a doctor, but rather the holographic expert who wrote him. The EMH was not intended to replace a ship's doctor, but rather to supplement a ship's medical team. Given a choice, I would choose any doctor on this list to, say, remove my appendix over the EMH. You'd basically be choosing the ship's computer to perform your surgery using a poorly matched personality interface. I find the EMH interesting, particularly in stories where his limitations are the driving plot point, when it would have been better if the USS Voyager had an actual doctor rather than a simulated one. This opinion should be no surprise to longtime viewers of this channel, as I have always been rather fiercely anti-holodeck. Doctor the First. Katherine Palaski from Star Trek The Next Generation. No, this is not a joke. Pulaski is my favorite Star Trek doctor. Only appearing as a special guest star in Season 2 of TNG, Pulaski was played by Star Trek veteran actress Diana Muldaur. Muldaur not only appeared in the original series as two separate characters, but also made a name for herself as a character actor seen in other shows, often playing doctors and scientists. This gave her gravitas as Dr. Pulaski. On United States submarines, you typically do not have MDs, medical doctors, on board. You have instead what is called an independent duty corpsman. Pulaski reminds me of an independent duty corpsman. An IDC is a member of the crew, but also not a member of the crew. It's weird. The corpsman can give medical orders to anyone, including the commanding officer. I've seen this cause some friction in real life. They also don't completely answer to the commanding officer either. When Pulaski first arrives on the Enterprise, she doesn't go to the captain's ready room, as is standard when a new senior officer reports. She instead goes to 10 forward.
Guinan?
Captain?
Where is Dr. Pulaski? Dr. Katherine Palaski.
Ah, you must be Captain Picard.
Doctor, protocol may have been lax on your last assignment, but here on the Enterprise...
Sit down, Captain. You'd better listen to this.
This is an officer who knows precisely what her position is and what she does and does not have to put up with, and I loved that about this character. There was a situation on my submarine where we were leaving port and the corpsman told the captain that he couldn't dive the ship because there was a crewman who had to go to the hospital. The captain was enraged that the corpsman would deign to tell him what he could do with his ship, and the corpsman calmly explained that if he did not turn the ship around and head back to port, the captain would be held medically negligent. There was nothing my boat's captain could do but obey. We weren't exactly used to seeing this on Star Trek before. To me, her being a woman had no part of this equation. She was the ship's CMO, Chief Medical Officer. She was directly responsible for the physical well-being of the crew. When she was operating in that capacity, the captain's concerns were secondary. Palaski also didn't put up with any crap either. In the show's second season, Chief O'Brien's character was basically given a tick where right before he would beam someone down, he would tell a joke at the officer's expense. Palaski didn't react well to this.
Here's the biofilters analysis of the microbes.
There's not much to go on.
I can override and beam Commander Riker aboard.
No, I better go down and make an evaluation there.
I hope these are the right coordinates. Just kidding, Doctor. I know how much you love the transporter.
About as much as I love comical transporter chiefs.
Keep in mind that Palaski was also a rather famous scientist in addition to being the ship's doctor.
Katherine Palaski, author of Linear Models of Viral Propagation?
That was a long time ago.
But still the standard. I can't think of anyone I'd rather be dealing with.
Palaski also had a technique for wiping short-term memories that Dr. Crusher failed to duplicate later in Who Watches the Watchers. Finally, Palaski managed to save Picard's life when a team of doctors failed at the apparently routine procedure of performing maintenance on Picard's artificial heart. Finally, Pulaski uttered what was, at the time, one of the coldest, most badass lines in all of Star Trek in the episode Up the Long Ladder. In the episode, the Mariposa colony, which was made up entirely of clones, needed assistance in order to keep their society alive. When Picard offers to help them by suggesting they breed with the Brinloidi, another colony, the leader of the Mariposa colony refuses. Pulaski then says this.
Fine. Destroy yourselves.
It's not so bad, Captain. In 50 years, we'll have a new Class M planet, complete with cities and ready for colonization.
Damn, dude, that was harsh.
Katherine Palaski was only seen in the second season of TNG, and when Beverly Crusher returned in season 3, Palaski was barely even mentioned again. I found Palaski to be superior to Dr. Crusher in more ways than not, and her brief stint on the show contributes to season 2 being my favorite season of TNG. Thank you for watching.